Very privileged today in that we have the wonderful Belinda Fettke joining us. Hi, Belinda.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, great to have you. Great to have you. A long time admirer of you and Gary's work. Um, we always start off with people telling us, taking us on their journey. So take us from how did you get involved in this crazy world of ours?
It is a crazy world. I'm going to start with a disclaimer to begin with. I just want to people to know that this conversation isn't about being anti-vegan or vegetarian. It's not anti-religion. It's about supporting people's choices. And when we had Nutrition for Life, and I know all the work you've done as well, we support people no matter where they're coming from. But understanding that this choice is being taken away from people who choose to include animal proteins and fats in their diet for their health has led me down this path and taken me into your world, which I never expected to do. So that's my disclaimer right from the beginning, because it's certainly not about individuals. It's about the corporate world, big food, big pharma, big church. So it's from there that I'm coming from, and happy to take questions from anyone.
Okay, well, let's start at the very beginning.
So, rhetoric question to start with. How did we get to a place where big food and big pharma can pay for research and on the back of it, dictate public health education, dictate our dietary and health guidelines? And we're a place where breakfast cereal companies can determine who can talk about nutrition and who can't. And that's been my fascinating experience. Gary was reported to the medical board in 2014 for recommending his patient with uncontrolled blood glucose with complications of type 2 diabetes requiring surgery from a non-healing ulcer on their foot, reduce their sugar. He was reported by a dietitian, and it was just like, what the? I honestly can't tell you how excited and naive Gary was when he worked out the association between sugar and type 2 diabetes in particular at the beginning. He was running around going, my gosh, Belinda, in a year, this is going to be all over. There won't be any more type 2 diabetes. And so he was very naive at the beginning and didn't actually realize that people have been having this conversation for a very long time. So Gary didn't go into medicine to band-aid sick care. And no doctor does. But I think it's really interesting if you think about medical education. You learn about anatomy and physiology, you learn about pathophysiology, but you learn about biology and chemistry, all those things in the first couple of years. And then you get siloed into band-aiding sick care. You get siloed into medicating and operating. And you tend to forget all those other things at the beginning. And as I say, when you look at the guidelines and they've been written with vested interests, and to talk outside those guidelines, you sort of think, well, guidelines should be flexible. Science should evolve from being challenged, not by being followed, which is this is Gary's favorite saying. And yet here he was in trouble. And when he was reported to the medical board, we honestly thought, they're just going to drop this case. This is ridiculous. It's about sugar. As I swear to you, the very first reporting was seriously only about sugar. And it was just a shock when they started asking more and more questions. And of course, Gary, not knowing the rules of UPRA back then, the rules of the medical board at the beginning, that you just don't give them a lot of information to reply to. You keep your answers very short and you ask questions. He kept getting more and more questions being asked. And it was a 2.5-year Star Chamber investigation. I think within a year of the first investigation, he was then reported again for inappropriately reversing type 2 diabetes. And you can't make it up, Peter. It's ridiculous. So I think understanding that, I went, well, I'm watching Gary, yourself, many others in this low carb space talk about the science, honestly, till you're blue in the face. And I just went, it just makes no sense. Like, I have a nursing background, but I didn't go to university. So my nursing background, I did 6 weeks of a series of lectures, and then I was thrown in the deep end. I was on the wards. I was seeing what was working and what wasn't. It was such a different way of learning compared to university, I believe. And so when something didn't make sense to me, I thought, well, initially, I'm going to write to the expert witness that's been brought on by the medical board to determine if an orthopedic surgeon can talk about reducing sugar. Like, he can talk about reducing cigarette smoking, but he's not a respiratory physician, and he could talk about increasing exercise, but he's not an exercise physiologist. So it all became, where do these lines blur? So I wrote to this man, and every email I could possibly find, I said, Gary is a lot like you, and I've looked up what you were challenging when you were a young man. Like, this just seems like such a good fit. You need to talk to him in person. But he never responded. And that pissed me off a little bit. So I thought, okay, this man must work for the sugar industry. And I honestly had cognitive dissonance. And I started diving down and Googling all sorts of things. But I suppose it came as no surprise to find that he was actually working for the cereal industry. And I reckon it was 6 months of collecting information, screen grabs, all sorts of things, because I found out that he'd been working for Sanitarium from the year 2000 all the way through Gary's investigation, right through to the end of 2016. And so we sent all these screen grabs to the board and we said, look, I think this is a conflict of interest that this man is working for the cereal industry. And the medical board said, we've asked him and he said it's not a conflict of interest and we believe him, not you. It's like, right. So let me tell you, when hashtag cereal for brekkie came after my husband, the mama bear came out and there was no going back. I uncovered documents actually describing in detail how the Dietitians Association of Australia, back in 2014-15, were accepting money from the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturers Forum. And this group was made up of 4 cereal industries: Nestle, Freedom Foods, Kellogg's, and Sanitarium. And they were paying the Dietitians Association of Australia $23,000 per year to use their members. And I think that's a really important statement: use their members. A lot of dietitians we spoke to had no idea about this corporate sponsorship being done. So they were to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal, grains, and even sugars messaging. It's like, what? Looking at these documents, Gary was the only practicing medical doctor in a hospital situation that was named as targeted for active defence. And yeah, that has led to the last 10 years of me looking into who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why.
Great story. And as many of our listeners would know, Gary eventually was exonerated quite rightly and apologised to and so on. But let's dive into it a little bit more. Maybe start with Sanitarium because Wheat Bix, we're all healthy and we're all
Aussie kids are Wheat Bix kids, aren't we?
Kids. Yeah, absolutely.
Aussie
a whole
kids
generation
are Wheat Bix
of Wheat Bix kids. Tell us who is Sanitarium?
Well, I thought the same question when I worked out this man was working for Sanitarium. I thought, just vaguely in my head, isn't that owned by a church? And I mean, I grew up in a Christian household. I taught Sunday school. So again, but I hadn't really conceptualized it. I grew up in Sydney and I knew of the Seventh-day Adventist hospital, vaguely aware of it. But I think in Australia, the Seventh-day Adventist church has a very small footprint in comparison to in America, where they own, there's 21 hospitals in Florida alone. So it's a huge footprint over there. But here, it's very small. We've got one, it was a university college when I first started investigating, but now it's been fledged as a full university up in New South Wales. They have the Sydney Adventist Hospital and a few smaller satellite hospitals involved with that. And they have a lot of educational facilities for primary and secondary school. But it's still, except for Aussie kids or Wheat Bix kids, we don't really know much about the church. And I started to do a bit of a deep dive into their beliefs, which has been a very interesting study in itself. The church was only formed in 1863, officially formed in 1863. And they have a prophetess who claimed to have had over 200 visions and dreams from God in her lifetime. She actually came to Australia in the late 1890s, or she came for 10 years, 1890 to nearly 1900, and she set up the church here. She wanted to start a health food business, and so Sanitarium was to become the health food business to take the place of flesh meat, milk, eggs, and butter. They were to produce foods to take the place of those things. And if you go back in time, well, John Harvey Kellogg had been the medical director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which is what they founded in America in the 1870s. And if you look at John Harvey Kellogg, when he was 12 years old, he went to work for the first family of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And Ellen taught that flesh meat defiled not only men, but women and children, spiritually, morally, and physically. And so you've had 12-year-old boys. I've had a 12-year-old son. You know, they're very impressionable. And at 12 years old, he was tasked with typesetting her book, A Solemn Appeal to Mothers. And this book spoke only of mothers deterring their children from masturbation. And she believed it was the most heinous sin of the time. And a lot of temperance health reformers did. It wasn't just her belief. But she blamed flesh meat as the major cause of that. And in this book, he's typesetting as a 12-year-old that masturbation will make you go blind, which I think we've even heard of even now. But it will cause criminal behavior. It will decay your head inwardly. It will cause epilepsy. And it's as if you put a pistol to your own heart and took your own life. And I often say in my talks, is it any wonder when this young boy grew up and became a man? I mean, the church paid for him to become a doctor. Is it any wonder that he spent his life trying to invent foods that would take the place of this food that he believed would cause heinous sin? Bland foods. He invented cornflakes. He invented the first alternative meat and it was made of nuttos at first, so nut, and then protos, which was a gooey soy mixture. And then she brought that model to Australia in the 1900s. And as I say, Aussie kids are Weet-Bix kids. So understanding the influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the global influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church on diet has been massive. It isn't the only thing, obviously, that is promoting a plant-based diet, but it's hugely influential in these dietary and health guidelines I've come across over the years. And even Nina Teicholz, we've been doing a little backward and forwarding with the dietary guidelines, the US dietary guidelines and the Australian ones, and understanding that the person who was put in charge of working out the caps on saturated fat for the US Dietary Guideline Committee was a devout Seventh-day Adventist who believes we should be eating no animal protein or fat. And so she was highlighting that in some of her work, is this the right person? And this is it might not be a financial conflict of interest, but I think a religious ideology is even more powerful than financial.
So what effect did sanitarium and the church have on diet in Australia?
Oh, well, I think we follow the Americans. So I think it's a long, long history going back through where's this come from. There was a guy called Mervyn Harding who did his doctoral dissertation to try and prove the health benefits of vegetarianism in the 1950s under Frederick Stair, who was found to be hugely supported by the sugar industry. And I say many times over, imagine Fred Stair's delight when someone comes to him without that financial conflict of interest and wants to prove that animal proteins and fats are bad for you. I mean, can you think of any more greater collaboration than that? And so they took their research then to the American Dietetic Association. They took it to the McGovern Senate report. Like, there's a lot of influences that have gone about from there, but I believe a lot of the research has come from the sugar and the food industry, from pharmaceutical industry, and from the Seventh-day Adventist Church to create these dietary guidelines. And certainly that meat is bad, meat causes cancer, all of these messaging. If you look into who is writing a lot of it's come from those sources, any of those sources, but certainly the cereal industry is hugely prolific in demonizing animal proteins and fats. And when you consider that a major inventor of the cereal industry, in fact, probably invention of commercial cereal, breakfast cereal in the world, was the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
And just a way, I mean, prior to that, breakfast was not considered a particularly important meal. And somehow the cereal makers have convinced the whole world that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. How did they do that?
Yes. Well, that was Ellen G. White, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, originally said it. John Harvey Kellogg carried that through, and his protege, Lena Francis Cooper, who founded the American Dietetics Association, said in that same year she founded that association, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, while writing cookbooks that you could only make her recipes if you used John Harvey Kellogg's inventions. So I would say she was the very first industry dietitian. Her brothers were devout Seventh-day Adventists. I can't find anywhere that she was in particular, though the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a lot of the members and people who write about the beginning of the Dietetics Association claim her as a Seventh-day Adventist, but she certainly was following their beliefs that meat was bad, animal proteins, animal fats, and how to reduce those in the diet. And she wrote the dietetic textbooks for 40 years without people understanding this is where it's come from. And an interesting fact that I'm still working on creating a really good graphic about it is that there were 8 food industries at that very first meeting when the Dietetic Association formed. And it formed really quickly during the war. In 1917, bang, within 3 or 4 weeks, they managed to get 8 companies to sponsor them. They worked out that the art of cookery could become the science of nutrition, and what better way to sell their products than to have scientists endorsing their product. So it's a really interesting history going right back as to who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why.
The obvious question, Belinda, is, how the hell did they get away with it? I mean, why didn't science challenge these beliefs?
This, in particular, the Seventh-day Adventist Church believe medical evangelism is the right arm of the church. So if you have a look in America, they educate doctors, they educate dietitians, they educate health professionals. It's just a really, really important part of their belief system. And if they said that medical evangelism is a way to take people to the gospel. It's an entering wedge that allows them to have discussions about food and health and all of those other things, and then bring people towards the gospel. They're commissioned. So if you think about Judaism, which also has very strict dietary beliefs, they don't want everybody to be a Jew. They're not out there trying to convert everybody to their beliefs. They honestly believe that this is a special thing for them. And I believe the same for a lot of other religions that I've looked at. Jainism is the strictest religion, and they won't eat any animal whatsoever. They won't eat at sunset in case they accidentally eat an insect. Like it's seriously strict about what they can and can't do. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church's mantra is to tell the gospel to everybody. And they're commissioned, and they honestly believe that until enough people have heard this message and made the choice to give up meat, that Jesus won't come back. So, when it's a belief like that, it's very, very powerful. And this is your salvation. So they're very determined to keep making this messaging happen. And I mean, you've advertised that we're talking about the Mediterranean diet, and that's tying into the blue zones. But I do believe that if you look at the Mediterranean diet, which Nina Teicholz has done a beautiful job with, and Zoe Harcum and many others in this space, but Ansel Keys looked specifically at Crete, and it's got an incredible history of invasions and whatever else was happening and people moving back into the mountains. But this concept of olive oil and this plant-based and this messaging that we hear over and over in the media is fraught with difficulty when you consider that a lot of his investigation was done during Lent, and Crete is profoundly Greek Orthodox. And so again, this is just different churches' beliefs on diet and what you should be doing. So with the Roman Catholic Church, fasting days mean only eat one meal a day. Abstinence Fridays, you don't eat any meat at all. But in the Greek Orthodox Church, you don't eat meat for 180 to 200 days a year. So if you go and talk to somebody who's a devout Greek Orthodox person and say, what are you eating? What have you eaten for the last week? Or what have you eaten for the 40 days of Lent? they eat no meat. But if they'd gone and chatted to them on the feasting day, the day after, they'd be seeing suckling pigs on a spit roast. These people, the people that they talk about who have health and longevity, I believe, have had that because they've included animal proteins and fats in their diet. We're talking about people who needed to be, these are self-sustaining communities. They're isolated communities. They didn't have the influence of Western industrialized processed food at their fingertips. And they generally tended to be poorer people. They needed to eat every part of an animal to maintain their health. And so considering that's in Crete, Ansel Keys also talked about Okinawa and said, it's just like the Mediterranean diet. It's the same sort of thing. Well, Okinawa history is fascinating. And you look at how China came in and manipulated a lot of what happened in Okinawa and organized sugar plantations and all sorts of other things. But they had a lot of pigs in Okinawa. They had 100,000 pigs before the war, the Second World War. And they'd never really been influenced in the same way with Buddhism and different taboos on eating animals. But when China decided they wanted to up their production of the sugar cane, they told them they weren't allowed to eat horse or cattle anymore because those animals were needed for ploughing and pulling the crushing machines and for the heavy work to extract the sugar cane. And so they ate a lot of pig. Pig became probably the most valuable resource to them for protein, animal proteins and fats in their diet. They did eat fish and they ate other things as well, but that was really important. And the other thing was sweet potatoes, because sweet potato crops could withstand it's got a very severe weather in this little island. In that space, they have a lot of hurricanes, they have a lot of other things. So sweet potatoes was also a safe plantation. But in the war, that went for nearly 3 months. They decimated Okinawa. The casualties were 145,000 Okinawans lost their lives. These are civilians. A third of their country was killed. And so there were 77,000 Japanese and 14,000 Americans. But you can imagine for 3 months, all the bombs, all the shelling, all the killing, the landscape was just devastated. They lost 93% of their buildings. So again, the fields, the crops, everything they had was just devastated. And the American government, the American forces took over and it claimed Okinawa as theirs, and they kept it till 1972 when it went back to the Japanese. But they did a study early on, and in 1949, and the US government actually says there was nothing there. The crops were almost bare. There was really nothing for people to eat. And so when Dan Buettner, because my big thing at the moment is the blue zones and Dan Buettner's work, when Dan Buettner looked back and he talked and he actually referenced this 1949 paper, is it any wonder that Okinawans said all they ate for breakfast, lunch and dinner was sweet potato, because they couldn't really get to anything else. Another spot that Dan Buettner talked about with the blue zones was Ikaria in Greece. Again, a Greek Orthodox country that fasted for 180 to 200 days of the year, but they ate pork. Okinawans ate pork. In fact, the American GIs introduced them to Spam because they felt so bad that they'd gotten rid of all their pigs. And Spam is a luxury in Okinawan diet. Even now, they serve it in restaurants. So, pork's big. And Dan Buettner does not mention that. He doesn't mention the fact that when he went to Sardinia, the oldest of the olds, these people that were looked at in Sardinia, it was founded because Giovanni Pes and Michel Pula were trying to define an area with a blue highlighter pen, and the blue zone revealed itself because it's such this tiny, tiny little spot in the mountainous area of Sardinia where the indigenous Sards have been pushed with invading nations trying to take over. They wanted the fertile lands. They wanted to mine the minerals and the gold and all the other things they could access down low. And they wanted to be able to fish because it was an abundant fishing area, turtles, all sorts of things. But the Sards had to eke out a living in this rugged mountain area. And they had goats, they had pigs, and Dan Butner talks again to one of the guys, and he said he walked into the house and it smelt of sausages, but he didn't think to ask this man, Mura, if he ate sausages. He didn't think to ask him if he'd eaten these fat-filled meat protein bombs his entire life. Again, they talk about plants, plants, plants. So the facts and fallacies, I've delved into that in a big way, and I think, looking back, a really important study was done by a guy called Weston A. Price. And he was a dentist, and he searched the world in the 1930s he was looking for good dental health and trying to work out why people in the 1930s in America were just getting so much tooth decay, and their jaws were narrowing and they weren't able to fit their wisdom teeth in. And so these 14 different places that he discovered around the world, including the Eskimos, including people in the Pacific Islands, and including Australian Aborigines. And he discovered that these 14 communities, when he actually tested their foods, and he discovered they had a very high content of vitamin A, D, and K2, which can really only be found in animal protein and fats. They came from different sources. All of them were completely different, but they were there. And so I don't believe you can have ancestral health. I don't believe these oldest olds anywhere in the world can possibly have this so-called health and longevity without animal proteins and fats. And yes, they do. I'm not saying they don't eat plants and they don't eat other things, but the messaging has been so skewed to fit the narrative, and that's very concerning.
Yeah, I think the blue zones is fascinating. I mean, you mentioned some of them are Crete and Sardinia and Okinawa and so on, and
Yeah.
they're really promoted as being justification for a non-meat lifestyle, aren't they? I mean, that's what they promote them at, and yet when you delve into it, as you have, it shows quite clearly that was not the case. I mean, that they were. There was also some quite interesting recent evidence that the so-called very elderly people, most of them were actually dead, and
Yes,
that
yes.
the
There's been
statistics
a lot.
were completely skewed. Yeah, so I mean,
Yeah.
I think I think there's so much evidence now that the whole blue zone thing is basically a marketing tool, isn't it?
It is a marketing tool because I talk about the 4 blue zones: Okinawa, Sardinia, Ikaria, and Nicoya in Costa Rica. And as I say, these people, generally the oldest olds, if they are actually as old as they say because of birth certificates, but we're not going into that. If they're as old as they are, they tend to be poor and illiterate. They tend to be self-sustaining, isolated communities, and they've not had westernized food introduced to them for most of their life, which could potentially give them a very good heads up in wellness. But what I challenge is, how do you sell this? Because it doesn't really sound like utopia if you really look hard at it. And it's certainly, how do you sell it to Americans who fear saturated fat, who fear sun, who don't spend their day walking up and down hillsides as shepherds and doing manual labor? How do you sell this utopia to America? And that's where Dan Butner included Loma Linda, which was founded by the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1905. Peter, she bought an abandoned hotel. It was on 260 acres of land in California, and she created the Mecca, really. I think for the first 30 years, everyone on the council was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. She built a hospital there. She built educational facilities, university, schools, the church, but she also built the food industry there. And out of all the other places that are ancestral diets, Loma Linda is the home of processed food. And I can't even understand. Like, there's nothing. They're affluent, they're educated. I think they said 97% of students who go through their schooling go on to college. Well, I can tell you, in these other blue zone areas, I don't think any of the oldest olds ever went to university or college, and most of them didn't even finish senior school. Like, it's just so different. And then we've been funneled into this, really, it's the Seventh-day Adventist church's blue zone that we've been packaged and marketed. And I found a document that Dan Brukner was selling the Blue Zone project to communities in America. And to become accredited, you had to pay $6.5 million in consulting fees to them. And I was just going, but my daughter's a change management consultant, and there becomes a bit of a template. And I'm sure when they go from one city to the next city to the next city, it all accrues and it becomes quite an easy thing. So $6.5 million to be accredited. Then in 2020, the 89th US Mayors Congress of Mayors passed that 1,400 mayors would adopt the Blue Zones project. So you've got 1,400 just dropped into your lap going, wow, here's instant, I wouldn't say money. But what really, really astounded me was in 2021, the Seventh-day Adventist Church bought the Blue Zones project. Right. So not only are they the pinnacle of the Blue Zone, but now they own it. And I do not believe that people who are promoting the Blue Zones, like Susie Burrell did recently, Joanna McMillan, like we've got a lot of very high-profile dietitians in the space talking about the Blue Zones. Tim Crow, and you just go, do they understand that the church now own it? And not only that, but Peter, I've been talking about the American College of Lifestyle Medicine for so long, because that was something that I came across very early in my studies, and it was founded on the Loma Linda University campus, the Seventh-day Adventist University campus, back in 2003 as the Christian Association of Lifestyle Medicine became the American College in 2004. They are now asking doctors to pay to be accredited as Blue Zone doctors. And they own the program, and now they're paying. I can't tell you. For me, the lack of transparency, I guess, is what I'm challenging. And the messaging that's coming from these people, like the American College of Lifestyle Medicine have something like 30 sister organizations around the world now. They're running education for doctors, dietitians, anyone in the health space, health coaches, everybody. And the messaging is demonizing animal proteins and fats because of a religious ideology. Coca-Cola became part of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine in 2010. So, I've been there for about 6 years. And then you've got people like Stephen Blair coming in who tried to found the Global Energy Balance Network. Is the American College of Lifestyle Medicine actually the Global Energy Balance Network? They're promoting doctors to write prescriptions for people to move more, eat less meat.
Well, I don't mind the move more bit, but not crazy on the eat less.
Move more is exercise as medicine. That's designed by Coca-Cola.
Coca-Cola, exactly.
Yeah, yes, so that's what I'm saying. Coca-Cola and lifestyle medicine have gotten together. Move more, exercise as medicine, eat less meat, food is medicine. It's fascinating, and that's why I really try to be respectful. I have friends. I'm communicating with beautiful people who are Seventh-day Adventists, people who are ex-Seventh-day Adventists all around the world. I've been communicating with them for years, and so it's not about individuals. This is about the corporate church that is not being transparent.
Yeah. And hugely influential in things like the dietary guidelines in the USA.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And here, because we follow.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's all a bit depressing, really, isn't it?
No. Don't be depressed. No? Okay. I think we're nice and loud. I go on about the story of Harvey Wiley. He was part of the Poison Squad. He was the head of the Poison Squad back in the early 1900s. He came in to try and fight the additives that were being put into the food, and he was probably given carte blanche going to the government and agitating to get rid of these things, but he could not get past Coca-Cola. At every level, they blocked, because at the time, Coca-Cola still included cocaine in their product. And he believed, along with a lot of other people, that this was causing a lot of criminal behavior. And Coca-Cola refused to take it out. They were making a fortune. And they'd come about because of the temperance movement, because you weren't allowed to drink alcohol. And just like, that's also another fascinating thing as to where the sugar industry really set foot in Coca-Cola. But Harvey Wiley, in the end, after about 9 years, just went, I've had enough. I'm walking away. And he went and worked for a women's magazine. And he wrote to the women, because they were the ones that were purchasing these products for their families. And he told them how bad they were. And I think it was something like 10,000 women marched on US Congress, and that's how cocaine got taken out of Coca-Cola. So we have the opportunity. We're talking to the people who can make the difference by their purchasing power.
Yeah. So how can we in Australia anyway? I mean, obviously we have limited influence over the Australian dietary guidelines, which are now halfway through a new process that is all a bit of a mystery to everyone, from what I can make out. And they've certainly not included anyone on their committee that is anything but traditional in their views on diet. So what can the average person do, other than purchasing, to sort of try and influence this whole situation?
You're asking me. I think be loud, be noisy.
Yep.
It's about having conversations, I think, and with as many people as you possibly can who could potentially have some influence. I think the more doctors and dietitians, I mean, look at the great work you've done. You've connected up with Dietitians Australia, and you're helping dietitians understand the health benefits of low carb, healthy fats. I think they can't deny it. So we just need to keep, I don't know, showing people, talking, spreading the word. And it's a long process. But when you look at the fact that low carb or therapeutic carbohydrate reduction has gotten into the national strategy for diabetes, there are things moving forward. But I think the most important thing is to just understand where this anti-animal protein and fat messaging is coming from, where this plant-biased messaging is coming from, and understanding that it's probably not really about health. It's not really health. People might feel healthy if they suddenly go vegan or go strict vegetarian and drop all the processed food. But is it giving up the meat that's made them feel healthier, or is it all the other things? And over time, when your body starts being depleted of bioavailable nutrients, it's probably not a great move either. But it's a step towards being healthier, as Gary always says. A lot of people will go in that progression. What can we do about it? Just keep talking. Just keep being there, keep listening, keep answering questions. But again, I can't be silent. So
no, we're very pleased you can't. The whole processed food industry obviously is incredibly profitable, very powerful. Have hundreds of lobbyists and have a lot of influence on government. Compared to little old us that are little putting our hand up and saying what about this, what about that. I mean, it's very, very challenging to try and take on such a massive industry, along with the pharmaceutical industry, who obviously benefit from the poor diet choices of most of the population. I mean, they're massive, very powerful enemies.
They are. And when you think that the Dietitians Association was prepared to sell out their dietitians for $23,000 per year, if we'd known, you and I, we could have done a really good crowdfund, change the conversation completely. Sure. Change the conversation. I think what's scary is the bias in the research. And the more we talk about these sort of things, hopefully people who are involved in those areas will start to question as well. But if you look at the dietary guidelines, Gary's gone into it in great detail. The 55,000 papers that the Dietitians Association of Australia at the time was supposed to have reviewed, The questions they were asked specifically was to look at the health benefits of grain and the harms of red meat. So when they did their 55,000 paper review, that's all they were looking for. They weren't looking for the benefits and the harms of grain and the benefits and the harms of red meat. It was a skewed question. So of course, when they get their answers, when they come together, oh, look how bad red meat is, look how good grains are. Well, no, it was so skewed. And I think the same with the Mediterranean diet. You look at the fine print, and do you know when they do their epidemiological surveys, you get points for eating the things they want you to eat. And then when you eat meat and dairy and the other things, you lose points. So the Med Diet score is counterintuitive. The Adventist Health Studies, the fine print is, if you're a vegan, you're eating meat less than once a month. Now, that does not come across to the public. If you speak to someone who is a vegan, they eat no animal protein or fat. But the Adventist Health Study allows them to term themselves or call themselves vegans, but maybe they're just getting enough, and maybe they weren't vegan their whole lives. Maybe they're just getting enough vitamin B12 and other things into their system. You can be vegetarian and have meat at least once a week. And again, that's not what we think of as vegetarians. So it's fine print of all these papers and understanding the true facts.
Yeah. Just want to clear up the Mediterranean diet thing, because that's, it's sort of, it's always quoted and as if, that's the perfect diet. And, we all have, visions of, sunny beaches, sitting on the beach of the Mediterranean, But for a start, the Mediterranean's a big place. I mean, there's a lot of countries, and
21 countries, 20 sovereign countries.
And 21 very different diets.
Very different,
and more than that. And yet somehow someone has come up with this term Mediterranean diet, and it's become the sort of the popular thing. And to me, the only thing they seem to agree on is lots of olive oil. But as you know, as
they don't have olive oil in Africa.
I know. As you and I both know, I mean, the majority of Mediterranean countries' diets are basically meat-based, and yet you would never know
all
that
of them are.
from what you hear of the Mediterranean diet. Less meat, more grains, legumes, etc., etc. How can they sort of pull the wool over our eyes like that?
As I say, they ask the questions during Lent. They ignore the fact that Moira's house smells like sausage and there are pigs in the backyard, and he was a shepherd all his life and walked up and down hills tending goats. These things, they've come at it with a belief, like what are the benefits of whole grain and what are the harms of red meat. They've gone into it with a belief system, and they want to sell something. And you can't just sell a diet that's animal protein based, animal fat based, when your whole, I guess your profiteering comes from cheap processed food.
Yep.
And the church make cheap processed food. Do you know one of the heads of Sanitarium actually developed the algorithms for the health star rating system?
That doesn't surprise me.
So is there any wonder, again, that you lose points for having saturated fat, you lose points for having real dairy in a product, whereas you gain points for the more processed soy and everything else, and sugar doesn't matter. Sugar doesn't get, it's neutral. There's no plus or minus for it. And so we're up against a system that we look at health star ratings and you think this is developed by the church.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. I mean, the majority of Australians would probably think the health star ratings are some independent body that's responsible. Whereas we know it's totally corrupt, and it's the old follow the money, which is very sad. I mean, surely food is more important, but it's a very profitable business. The food,
but olive oil was definitely used in Crete, but they also used lard. They had pigs, and again, you get 20 litres of lard from a pig, and that is a hell of a lot of cooking. Okay, you can't use it during your fasting time as a Greek Orthodox, but when you're not fasting, it was used in everything. Like, it was a very cheap source of fat that could also survive without being refrigerated.
Mm. Well, our grandparents used to cook with lard. I mean,
Exactly.
until
Yeah.
they never heard of all these fancy vegetable oils and so on. I mean,
No.
that's the other. That's obviously the other. Fascinating development of the last century. Really, is the proliferation of these vegetable oils, as they call them. They're seed
Yes.
oils, as we know, but vegetable sounds healthier, so let's call them vegetable oils.
They're seed
The
oils,
hateful,
yes.
the hateful eight. And compared to the traditional means of cooking, using lard, using butter, using olive
Ghee.
oil and ghee and
Mm.
beef tallow and so on.
Yep.
I mean, McDonald's switched from beef tallow to vegetable oils, 30 years ago or something like that, and haven't looked back, have they?
Well, I did hear that there is a McDonald's now in America who's gone back to tallow. They're trying
All
it,
right.
or
I know there are
lard, or
certainly
trying
some
it.
other hamburger chains, some of the smaller ones, to be honest, ones I'd never heard of, but there were 3 or 4 that had gone back to beef tallow. And maybe, eventually through pressure, McDonald's will at least make that change. But why, I mean, or how and why has the seed oil industry been so successful?
Profitability. They get subsidies from the US government. It's just a commercial process. I think, interestingly, going back, I mean, Nina Teicholz spoke with you about it, but when Procter and Gamble worked out that they could make Crisco, it looked like lard at the beginning. And do you know they set up a whole industry in Israel, because in Judaism you're not allowed to eat meat and dairy in the same meal. So providing them with a lard lookalike that was made from a vegetable oil, hydrogenated, because then it became the consistency, was just amazing. And they were so excited. So that has been one of their, well, certainly at the beginning, was one of their biggest purchases, because it just suited so nicely that they could suddenly cook with something that was very much like an animal fat. But that may explain some of the Jewish paradox with their heart. They've got a lot of heart issues, and they adopted hydrogenated oils very, very early, adopted them very quickly.
And yet they're supposed to be heart healthy, I was told.
Ah, yes. Well, I did hear you also talk with Nina about hydrogenated oils.
Yeah.
Do you know we haven't actually gotten rid of them in Australia? They've banned them officially in America. And the RACGP was writing, someone in the RACGP was writing, I've got the documents, a couple of years ago, just asking for our government to stop putting them in, because they're in things like cheap croissants and cheap pies and the things you get at the cheap bakeries. Unfortunately, we are still using hydrogenated oils, and they are much more harmful than even seed oils. So
how do we know when there's hydrogenated oils around? I mean, how can we pick it?
Pastry.
Okay.
Cheap pastry, not good French pastry. That was made with butter.
Yep.
Again, the paradox. Why do the French?
Yep.
Why do the French so healthy when they live on butter? Yeah, so we do actually still have hydrogenated oils here. They might not sell it so much, but commercially it's very available, and you would find most cheap versions of pies and pastries all have hydrogenated oil still in them, which is okay if maybe you eat it once or twice a year. But if you're having it every single week, it is going to build up and it's going to cause harm.
What sort of harm is it going to give you?
Oh, don't ask me. You should know. You're the doctor.
Well, yeah.
Hydrogenated oils. Only because Fred Kummerow was a doctor in the US who was advocating the harms of hydrogenated oil. I'm aware of the people and what they were advocating. No, I don't know all what.
No, I think it's probably related to inflammation. I would think.
Inflammation,
I think,
absolutely.
Inflammation is now perceived really as the key to the development of disease, and hydrogenated oils are top of the list. Along with sugar, and it's a lethal combination, the two of them. So it's not surprising that we're having all these heart issues and so on, and yet somehow the seed oil industry has managed to convince the world that they're heart healthy. And
Mhm.
I think with a bit of help from some of their friends in at Harvard and a few other places who probably do very
Yes.
well out of all of that. But anyway, we won't
And
go
the
there.
American Heart Association, didn't they
Well,
receive
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
millions of
yeah,
dollars to promote heart healthy
yeah,
seed oils?
yeah, indeed. Well, Ben, time's up, I'm afraid. I've got to say, I mean, you've done an amazing job ferreting out. I think you should have been a detective, probably. Just to get in behind the scenes and open our eyes, really, to things like the influence of the Seventh Day Adventist Church, of Sanitarium, none of which any of us would have known about if it hadn't been for your work with that. So well done. I mean, I think you
Well,
made a
I wouldn't have
really
known about
important.
it if it hadn't they hadn't come after Gary.
Well, yeah, sure, yeah. Well, so we've got to thank the unnamed dietitian at Launceston General Hospital who dobbed Gary in. She's actually probably done the world a favour in some ways, even though there's a
Yes.
lot of short term pain for both of you, and we all feel for what the two of you went through, and you've been a fantastic support to Gary, but in your own right, you've made a really significant contribution. So
Thank
thank
you.
you on behalf of everyone, and keep up the good work. And thanks for your time
And
today.
thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for watching.
Okay, that's it. We'll be back next month with another webinar in the Defeat Diabetes series.
We're done. Yeah, everything seemed to run really well. So yes, I'm happy. No glitches. Yeah. We had a big, we had a lot of YouTube comments, and I mean, all very